When the heat dies at -15, you don't feel it first, you hear it. But what I didn't realize at the time was that my heat didn't fail. Someone had shut it off. The house was too quiet. No low hum from the furnace. No soft click of the thermostat cycling on. Just a heavy, suffocating silence pressing in from every wall like something alive. My breath came out in thin white clouds, drifting in front of my face and dissolving into the dark like smoke. I was still half asleep when I reached for the blanket, pulling it tighter around my shoulders. But the cold had already settled deep into the bones of the house. You could feel it in the floorboards, in the walls, in the air itself. Not just cold, something invasive. The digital thermostat on the wall glowed a dull blue, 42 degrees Fahrenheit inside and dropping. Outside, my phone said it was -15 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. That's the kind of cold that doesn't forgive mistakes. The kind that bursts pipes, cracks foundations, and turns a quiet suburban home into a liability overnight. I swung my legs off the bed, and my feet hit hardwood that felt like ice. The shock ran straight up my spine. The furnace should have kicked on hours ago. It always did. I installed that system myself 3 years back. High-efficiency gas furnace, dual stage, calibrated down to the decimal. I knew every inch of it. And right then, it was dead. I moved fast, grabbing a hoodie from the chair and pulling it over my head as I stepped into the hallway. The air smelled wrong. Not gas, not burning, just cold metal and stillness. Like something had been cut off at the source. And about 5 minutes later, I found out exactly who was behind it. I opened the utility closet and crouched in front of the unit. No blinking status light. No ignition attempt. Nothing. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was offline. That's when my stomach tightened. Systems don't just go offline like that. Not without a reason. I checked the breaker. Fine. Checked the control board. No fault codes. I ran my hand along the intake line, then the gas valve. Cold. No flow. The realization didn't hit all at once. It settled in. This wasn't a failure. Someone had shut it down. I stood there for a second, listening to the silence again, but now it felt different. Intentional. Outside, the wind pushed against the siding with a low, steady howl, like it was waiting for permission to come inside. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the utility app. Account active. No outages reported. No maintenance notices. Nothing that explained why my heat had been cut in the middle of a cold snap that could put someone in the hospital if they weren't careful. Then I saw the notification icon. One unread message. Not from the gas company. From the HOA. I opened it, already feeling that familiar pressure building behind my eyes. Notice of violation. Unauthorized system modification. Immediate compliance required. Service disruption may occur until resolved. I read it twice. Slower the second time. Like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Unauthorized modification? I'd filed permits. Passed inspection. Everything was up to code, better than code, actually. There was nothing in that system they could legally touch, let alone shut down. And yet here I was, standing in a house that was bleeding heat by the minute while the temperature outside sat deep below zero. My grip tightened around the phone. I could picture her already. Victoria Hale. Standing in her perfectly heated living room with that practiced smile, talking about community standards like she was protecting something instead of controlling it. She'd sent warning letters before, about things that didn't matter, things she could enforce because no one wanted the hassle of pushing back. But this wasn't a warning. This was a line crossed. I walked back into the living room and looked out through the frost creeping along the edges of the windows. The street was still dark, quiet. Every other house warm and untouched under the same frozen sky. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a system-wide issue. It was targeted. Just me. I exhaled slowly, watching the vapor drift away, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. Not panic. Not even anger yet. Just clarity. Because if they thought they could cut me off from my own heat, and I'd just sit here and freeze, then they had no idea who they were dealing with. I glanced back toward the utility closet, already replaying the system layout in my head. Lines, valves, pressure zones, control points. Things most people never think about. But I did. And the more I thought about it, the more one detail stood out. Something small. Something that didn't fit. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. Because I needed to see the main line for myself. Something about this shutdown didn't add up. I stepped outside and the cold hit like a wall. Sharp, immediate, the kind that makes your lungs hesitate before the next breath. The gravel under my boots crunched loud in the stillness, every sound amplified by the frozen air. Streetlights cast pale halos over identical driveways, each house sealed tight, each window glowing warm, except mine. That contrast stayed with you. It told you this wasn't random. It told you someone had made a decision. I pulled my coat tighter and walked down the side of the house toward the gas meter, my breath trailing behind me in slow white bursts. The metal casing sat against the wall, rimmed with frost, but the gauge inside was what mattered. I wiped the glass with my glove and leaned in. Zero flow. Not reduced. Not fluctuating. Cut. Clean and deliberate. I followed the service line to the shutoff valve. Lock position. That stopped me. Gas companies don't shut off residential service in extreme cold without notice, and they definitely don't lock a valve unless there's a safety issue or a legal order behind it. Neither of those applied to me, which meant one thing. Someone had accessed a control point they had no right touching. I straightened slowly, scanning the line as it disappeared into the ground, tracing the path in my head like I had done 100 times before on job sites. I knew this infrastructure. I'd spent years working with regional utility contractors, calibrating pressure systems, mapping distribution zones, fixing problems most people never even knew existed. And back then, I learned something simple. Every system has a hierarchy, and if you know where to look, you can see exactly who has the authority to do what. This didn't match any legitimate action. I stepped back and looked up at the houses across the street. No frost on their windows. No frozen edges. Their furnaces were running. Their lines were active. Whatever had happened here had been isolated to my property, and that narrowed things down to something I wasn't going to like. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again, scrolling past the notice from the homeowners association, reading it one more time with a colder kind of focus. Unauthorized system modification. They were claiming I had altered something that gave them justification, at least in their own framework, to enforce compliance. But enforcement does not include cutting off a primary utility. Not legally. Not even close. My jaw tightened as I thought back to the last inspection I had done on this place. Everything was documented. Permits filed, approvals stamped, system registered. There was no loophole there, which meant this was not about code. This was about control. And if Victoria Hale had decided to test how far that control extended, then she had picked the wrong system to experiment with. I walked back toward the front of the house, the cold biting through my gloves now, seeping into my fingers as I reached for the railing and paused for a second. The street was still quiet, but not as still as before. Somewhere down the block, a furnace kicked on with a low, steady hum. That sound carried, a reminder that heat was still moving through the network, still flowing through lines that connected every house on this street. Lines I understood better than most people ever would. I thought about the way the distribution grid was laid out here, about the pressure regulators at each segment, about the choke points where flow could be adjusted or stopped entirely if needed. It was not something homeowners ever saw, but it was always there, working in the background, invisible until it was not. I had been part of designing sections of systems just like this, had stood in freezing conditions making sure they held under stress, making sure people inside stayed warm without ever thinking about it. That was the point. Comfort built on invisible structure. And right now, someone had decided to use that structure as leverage. I exhaled slowly, watching the vapor drift away again, and felt that earlier clarity sharpen into something more defined. This was not a mistake. It was a calculated move, and like any calculated move, it relied on an assumption. The assumption that I would not understand what had been done. The assumption that I would not know where to look. I glanced back at the meter one more time, then down the street, mentally mapping the line as it branched out beneath the pavement, feeding each home in. Sequence. There was a pattern there, one I had worked with before, one that could be traced if you knew how to read it. And the more I thought about it, the more one possibility stood out, something that would explain both the isolation and the precision of the shutdown. I turned toward the driveway, already moving before the thought fully settled, because there was one place that would confirm it beyond any doubt. I needed to check the upstream regulator. I did not need to drive far. About 3 houses down, right where the sidewalk curved slightly around a patch of frozen grass, there was a green metal box half buried in the ground, the kind most people walked past every day without noticing. It sat there quietly, collecting frost, humming faintly if you knew how to listen, regulating pressure for the entire segment of homes on this side of the street. That was the upstream regulator. That was the control point. My boots slowed as I approached it, the cold air stinging the exposed skin around my eyes. The neighborhood still looked asleep, but I had learned a long time ago that systems like this never really slept. They just ran in the background, doing their job until someone interfered. I crouched down and brushed a thin layer of frost off the panel, revealing the service markings underneath. Utility company logo. Serial number. Inspection date stamped from just 3 months ago. Everything looked normal on the surface. Too normal. I ran my hand along the side and felt the slight vibration of gas moving through the line. That meant the system was active. It was feeding the homes beyond this point, just not mine. I moved around to the access panel and paused for a second, listening. No alarms. No pressure irregularities. That told me something important. The system itself was not in failure mode. It was operating exactly as instructed, which meant the instruction had been intentional. I straightened up and scanned the nearby houses again, noticing small details that most people would miss. A faint plume rising from a vent across the street. A soft mechanical hum behind a garage door. Heat cycling normally. That confirmed the isolation. My line had been selectively shut off somewhere between this regulator and my meter. That narrowed the window down to a very specific section of pipe, one that was not accessible to just anyone. You needed clearance, or access, or someone who thought they had authority where they did not. I stepped back and looked at the regulator box again, this time not as a homeowner, but as someone who had spent years reading systems like maps. If someone had wanted to make a point without triggering a wider alert, this was exactly how they would do it. They would not touch the main line. They would not risk a full segment shutdown. They would isolate a single property and justify it under some kind of administrative claim, hoping no one questioned the method. My jaw tightened as a name surfaced in my mind again, sharper this time, more defined. Victoria Hale. She did not understand infrastructure, but she understood leverage. She understood paperwork, perception, and pressure. And if she had convinced herself that a notice and a label were enough to justify this kind of move, then she had crossed into territory she could not control. I pulled out my phone again, not to check messages this time, but to pull up a set of old project files I still kept stored for reference. Layout diagrams, pressure zones, valve indexing. I zoomed in on the section that matched this neighborhood, tracing the route from the regulator to my property. There it was, a secondary cutoff point, installed for maintenance isolation, positioned just before the line branched into my service connection. It was not meant for routine use. It was not something an HOA had any business touching. And yet, given what I was seeing, it was the only place this could have been done without affecting the rest of the street. I felt a slow, controlled breath leave my chest as everything started to align. This was not guesswork anymore. This was a method, a deliberate, targeted action using infrastructure they did not fully understand. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood there for a moment, letting the cold settle around me again, but it felt different now. Less like something pressing in and more like something I was moving through. Because once you understood the system, the fear changed. It became information. It became leverage. I turned and looked back toward my house, the windows already frosting over at the edges, the interior temperature dropping minute by minute. That was the immediate problem. But it was not the only one. If they had done this once, they would do it again. If they believed they could control access to something like this, then they had already gone too far. I started walking back up the driveway, my pace steady now, my mind already shifting from reaction to analysis, from analysis to response. There were rules that governed these systems, layers of regulation that existed for a reason, and anyone who bypassed them did not just create inconvenience. They created liability. And liability had consequences. I reached the front door and paused, glancing once more at the street behind me, at the quiet houses still wrapped in warmth they assumed would always be there. That assumption was fragile. It depended on people respecting boundaries they could not see. I opened the door and stepped back inside, the cold air following me in, and headed straight for the utility closet again, because now I knew exactly what I was looking at. And more importantly, I knew exactly where it had started. The question was not whether this could be reversed. The question was how far they had already pushed it. I shut the door behind me, and the silence inside felt heavier than before, like the house itself was waiting for something to give. The temperature had already dropped another few degrees. You could feel it in the air, thinner now, sharper against your skin. The kind of cold that does not stay contained. It spreads. It moves through walls, into pipes, into places you do not see until it is too late. I walked straight to the thermostat and tapped the screen again, more out of habit than hope. Still unresponsive. No call for heat. No system activity. Just a steady decline, 1 degree at a time. I exhaled slowly and turned back toward the utility closet, opening it wider this time, pulling the panel off the furnace to expose the internal components. The metal casing was already colder than it should have been, the internal temperature dropping along with the rest of the house. I reached in and checked the control board again, tracing the wiring with my fingers, confirming what I already knew. No ignition sequence. No gas flow. The system was not trying to run because it had nothing to run on. That meant one thing. Supply had been cut upstream. And the system had accepted it as a condition, not an error. That was by design. Safety protocols always assume loss of supply is legitimate. They do not question it. They adapt. That is what made this so dangerous. I stood there for a moment, listening again, and then I heard it. A faint ticking sound from somewhere deeper in the house. Not mechanical. Structural. I followed it down the hallway toward the kitchen, each step echoing slightly louder now that the usual background noise was gone. The sink sat still, the faucet untouched, but the pipes beneath it were starting to react to the cold. Expansion. Contraction. Stress building where it should not. I crouched down and opened the cabinet, reaching in to touch the line. It was colder than it should have been this early. Not frozen yet, but heading there. Fast. That shifted the timeline in my head. This was no longer just about comfort. This was about damage. Once pipes freeze, they do not just stop working. They crack. And when they thaw, that is when everything floods. I stood up quickly and moved back into the living room, scanning the space like I was seeing it for the first time. Every wall, every line, every system tied into the same problem now. Heat was not optional at this temperature. It was structural protection, and someone had decided to remove it as leverage. My grip tightened as I picked up my phone again and scrolled through my contacts, stopping on one name before I even realized I had selected it. Victoria Hale. I stared at it for a second, weighing the call, knowing exactly how it would go. She would answer calm, controlled. She would reference the notice, the violation. She would speak in that tone that made it sound like she was offering a solution when she was actually reinforcing control. I pressed call anyway. It rang twice before she picked up. Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice smooth, composed, exactly as expected. I assume this is about the notice. I looked around the room again, at the frost creeping further along the window edges, at the thin layer forming where warmth used to be, and kept my voice level. You shut off my gas. There was a brief pause, not surprise, just calculation. Your property is currently non-compliant with community infrastructure guidelines, she replied. Until that is resolved, certain services may be restricted. I let that sit for a second, not because I needed to process it, but because I wanted to hear how far she would go with it. You do not have the authority to restrict a primary utility, I said. Not legally. Not under any guideline. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Then a small shift in her tone, almost imperceptible, but there. We are acting within the scope of community enforcement, she said. If you would like to dispute that, you are welcome to file through the appropriate channels. Appropriate channels. Paperwork. Delays. Time. All things that worked in her favor while my house continued to lose heat by the minute. I glanced back toward the hallway, toward the pipes I had just checked, and felt something settle into place again, sharper now, more defined than before. This was not a misunderstanding. This was pressure applied deliberately, using time and temperature as leverage. And she believed it would work. Turn it back on, I said, keeping my voice steady. Now. There was no hesitation this time. Resolve the violation, she replied, just as steady. And service will be restored. The line went quiet after that. Not disconnected, just finished. I lowered the phone slowly and stood there for a moment, the cold pressing in from every side, the ticking from the pipes growing slightly more frequent now. This was escalation. Clear and direct. They had moved from notices to action, from suggestion to enforcement, and they had done it in a way they thought I could not challenge quickly enough to matter. I turned back toward the utility closet one more time, not to check the system again, but to confirm something else. Control points, access, authority, all things that could be misused if someone believed they understood them well enough. I reached down and ran my hand along the main line again, feeling the absence of flow, the stillness where there should have been movement, and then I straightened up, already shifting from reaction to response. Because if they were willing to use infrastructure as leverage, then they had already opened a door they could not close. I grabbed my keys from the counter, my mind already mapping out the system beyond my property, beyond this street, beyond the narrow view they were operating under. They thought this was contained. They thought it was controlled. They thought it ended at my meter. I stepped toward the door, pulling on my gloves again, because the moment they made this about infrastructure, it stopped being local. I stepped back outside, and this time I did not feel the cold the same way, because now it was not just temperature anymore. It was a countdown. The sky had shifted into that pale gray that comes just before full daylight, and the street was starting to wake up in small, quiet ways. A garage door down the block creaked open. Somewhere a car engine turned over, the low rumble steady and warm, a contrast that made the silence inside my own house feel even more deliberate. I walked past my truck without stopping and headed straight toward the corner where the sidewalk met the main access road, because I already knew calling the HOA was a dead end. That had not been a conversation. That had been a message. And if I was going to respond, I needed something more than words. I pulled out my phone again and scrolled to a different contact this time. Someone who actually understood how these systems worked outside of paperwork and authority titles. Mark Jensen, Senior Field Supervisor for the Regional Gas Utility. I had worked alongside him on 2 major distribution upgrades a few years back, long days in freezing conditions, calibrating pressure regulators, and testing flow integrity across entire subdivisions. He picked up on the third ring, his voice rough with early morning fatigue. Ethan, everything all right? I did not waste time. My line has been cut upstream, I said. Clean isolation. No fault codes. No outage notice. There was a pause on the other end, longer than casual concern. This was professional attention. You sure it is not a regulator issue? He asked. Positive, I replied. Segment is live. Neighboring lines are active. My meter is locked, and there is zero flow. Someone hit the maintenance cutoff before my service branch. Another pause, shorter this time, sharper. I could almost hear him shifting into work mode. That valve is not publicly accessible, he said. Only utility crews should be touching that. I looked back down the street again, at the neat row of houses, at the illusion of order that depended on systems no one questioned. I know, I said quietly. That is why I am calling you. There was a faint sound of movement on his end, like he was already getting up. I can pull the service logs, he said. If anyone authorized a shutoff, it will be in the system. Do that, I replied. Because if it is not there, we have a bigger problem. He did not argue. Give me 15 minutes, he said, and the line clicked off. I lowered the phone and stood there for a second, letting the cold settle back into my awareness. This was the part most people never saw. The invisible layer where decisions were either documented or they were not. And undocumented actions inside a regulated utility system did not just disappear. They created gaps. Gaps that someone had to answer for. I turned and walked slowly back toward my house, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. Each step measured now, controlled. The initial shock was gone. The anger was still there, but it had shifted into something more precise. Because now there were only 2 possibilities. Either the utility company had authorized this, which would mean something was seriously wrong at a higher level, or someone had acted outside of that system entirely. And if it was the second option, then this was not just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was interference with regulated infrastructure. I reached my front porch and paused again, looking at the thin layer of frost now spreading across the inside of the windows, the edges thickening as the interior temperature continued to drop. The house was losing the race against the cold, and I could hear the pipes again, that faint ticking turning into a sharper, more irregular pattern. Tom was not on my side. I stepped inside and shut the door quickly, trapping what little heat remained, and moved straight to the kitchen, opening cabinets, pulling out towels, anything I could use to insulate the exposed lines. It was not a solution, just a delay. I turned the faucet slightly, letting a thin stream of water run, enough to keep movement in the pipes, enough to buy a little more time. The sound of running water filled the room, steady, controlled, a small system still functioning inside a larger one that had been cut off. I checked my phone again. No messages yet. That meant Mark was still digging, still pulling records, still looking for something that either existed or did not. I leaned against the counter for a moment, staring at the sink, at the steady flow of water, and felt the full weight of what had just been set in motion. Because if there was no record of this shutdown, then someone had bypassed not just procedure, but accountability. And that never stayed contained for long. I pushed myself off the counter and walked back toward the utility closet one more time, not to fix anything yet, but to confirm the timeline in my head, to align what I knew with what I was about to find out. 15 minutes could change everything. The difference between a mistake and a violation. The difference between a dispute and a case. I stood there, listening to the silence again, waiting for the phone to ring, because whatever Mark found was going to tell me exactly how far this had gone. The screen lit up just as the pipes clicked again. The phone buzzed once in my hand, sharp and immediate, cutting through the quiet like a signal finally breaking through static. I answered before the second vibration even finished. "Tell me you found something," I said. There was no small talk on the other end. Mark's voice came back tighter now, fully awake, fully locked in. "Yeah," he said, "and you are not going to like it." I walked slowly toward the living room window, watching the frost creep further across the glass as he continued. "There is no service order on your address," he said. "No scheduled maintenance, no emergency shutoff, nothing logged in the system for your line in the last 30 days. I stopped moving. That was the confirmation. Clean. Direct. No ambiguity. "Then how is my valve locked?" I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear him say it. There was a short pause, not hesitation, just the weight of what he was about to confirm. "If what you are describing is accurate," he said, "then someone accessed that cutoff manually without authorization." The words settled heavy, but they did not surprise me. They aligned perfectly with everything I had already mapped out in my head. "That valve requires a service key," he added. "An access clearance. It is not something an HOA board can just decide to use." I let out a slow breath, watching it fog. The glass in front of me. "They did not just decide," I said quietly. "They acted." Another pause, longer this time. "You need to be careful with how you handle this," Mark said. "If this turns into a dispute, it needs to stay documented. Do not escalate without a record." I glanced back toward the utility closet, toward the silent system sitting idle behind that panel, and felt something shift again, more defined now, more focused. "I am not guessing anymore," I said. "I know exactly where they cut it and how they did it." "Then you also know," he replied, "that if they crossed into utility control, that is not just a policy issue. That is liability." Liability. That was the word that mattered. Not inconvenience. Not compliance. Liability meant consequences that extended beyond letters and fines. It meant oversight, investigation, accountability. "Can you get someone out here?" I asked. "Officially, I can flag it," he said, "but it will take time. Dispatch is backed up with cold weather calls. You are not the only one dealing with system stress right now." I nodded slowly, even though he could not see it. That made sense. Extreme temperatures pushed systems to their limits, which meant delays, which meant more time without heat. "How long?" I asked. "Best case, a few hours," he said. "Worst case, end of day." I closed my eyes for a second, picturing the pipes under the sink, the thin stream of water I had left running, the ticking that was getting sharper with each passing minute. Ours was not a buffer. It was a risk. "I do not have that kind of time," I said. "Then you need to keep your internal lines moving," he replied. "Open cabinets, run water, keep circulation where you can. You already know the drill." I did. That was the problem. I knew exactly how quickly things could go from stable to damaged in conditions like this. And I knew that waiting for a standard response window was not going to protect anything inside my house. "If I confirm the cutoff point and document it," I said slowly, thinking through the next step as I spoke, "that is enough to trigger an internal review, right?" "If you have evidence of unauthorized access?" Mark said. "Yeah, that gets attention fast." I looked down at my phone, then back toward the door, my mind already moving ahead, connecting pieces, aligning steps. Evidence. Documentation. Those were not obstacles. Those were tools. "All right," I said. "I will handle it from here." "Ethan," he said, stopping me before I could end the call, "do not do anything that puts you in the middle of a liability issue. Let the system handle it. I let a small breath out. Not quite a laugh. Not quite agreement. I am already in the middle of it, I said. I just need to decide how to respond. There was nothing else for him to say after that. The line went quiet, then disconnected. I lowered the phone slowly, the weight of the situation settling in fully now, but it did not feel overwhelming. It felt structured, defined, because now there was no uncertainty left. This was not a gray area. This was a boundary that had been crossed. I turned toward the front door again, the cold inside the house pressing closer now, the ticking from the pipes sharper, more frequent, a reminder that time was still moving whether I acted or not. They had made a move using infrastructure they did not control. They had assumed it would hold, that I would not challenge it fast enough to matter, that I would wait. I reached for my coat again, pulling it on with steady hands, my thoughts already narrowing into a clear path forward. Because once something like this was confirmed, once the system itself had been bypassed, there was only one way to deal with it properly. You do not argue. You do not wait. You respond within the same framework they just stepped into. I grabbed my keys and opened the door, the cold air rushing in again, sharper this time, but it did not slow me down. If they wanted to use the system as leverage, then they had just given me a map. I moved with purpose now, not rushing, not hesitating, just following the path the system itself had already laid out. The cold air cut across my face as I headed back toward the regulator, but this time I was not just observing. I was documenting. Every step mattered now. I pulled my phone out and switched to video, the screen lighting up against the pale morning, capturing the frost-covered street, the quiet houses, the stillness that hid everything happening underneath. I crouched beside the green metal box again and angled the camera down, brushing away the frost with my glove to expose the panel markings. Upstream regulator, segment 3. I said quietly, my voice steady, not for anyone else but for the record. Active flow confirmed. No system-wide disruption. I moved slowly around the box, recording the intact seals, the inspection tag, the absence of any official markings that would indicate authorized work. Everything looked untouched here, which was exactly the point. Whoever had done this knew not to disturb the primary control. They had gone smaller, more precise. I stood up and turned the camera toward the line running underground, tracing its direction with my movement, narrating without thinking now, the habit of field work taking over. Service branch splits approximately 20 feet downline, I said. Maintenance cutoff positioned before individual feed. That was where I needed to go next. I walked along the path I had already mapped in my head, counting steps, watching the spacing between properties, aligning what I saw with what I knew. The cold made everything sharper. Sounds carried farther. My boots against the frozen ground, the distant hum of other systems running, the faint whistle of wind moving across the open street. It all layered together into something that felt almost mechanical, predictable, until it was not. I stopped near the edge of my property, just before the line would branch toward my meter, and crouched again, brushing away a thin layer of snow from a small access cover set flush with the ground. Most people would never notice it. Just another piece of infrastructure hidden in plain sight. But I knew exactly what it was. I angled the camera closer and lifted the cover slowly. The metal underneath was exposed to the cold, a dull gray surface that told a very specific story the moment I saw it. The valve position was not neutral. It was not partially adjusted. It was fully closed. Clean. Intentional. I held the camera steady for a second, letting the image settle, letting the evidence speak for itself. Then I moved it slightly to the side, capturing the lock mechanism attached to the valve. Not a standard utility seal. Not the kind issued through official channels. This was different. Aftermarket. Something someone had added to ensure the position stayed exactly where they wanted it. My jaw tightened slightly as I leaned in closer, focusing on the details. No service tag. No work order number. No identification marking at all. That was the gap. The absence that confirmed everything. Unauthorized manual cutoff. I said quietly, the words deliberate, clear. No utility documentation. No system record. I straightened up slowly, keeping the camera rolling as I stepped back, framing the location in relation to my house, to the street, to everything that connected this single point to the rest of the system. This was not speculation anymore. This was proof. And proof changed the structure of the situation completely. I lowered the phone slightly, but did not stop recording, letting the camera capture the environment as I processed the next step. Because now the situation had moved past assumption, past interpretation. It had entered documentation. And documentation meant accountability. I turned back toward the house, the frost on the windows now thicker, more defined, the interior losing ground with every passing minute. The urgency was still there, but it felt different now. Less chaotic, more controlled. Because I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was preparing to respond within the same system they had misused. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stood there for a moment, the cold settling around me again, but it no longer felt like pressure. It felt like context. Because the system did not care about intention. It responded to input. And someone had just shown me exactly how they thought it worked. I looked down once more at the exposed valve, at the clean, deliberate position it had been forced into, and then back up at the quiet street, at the houses still running warm on the same network they assumed was untouchable. That assumption was the mistake, not the action itself, the belief behind it. I pulled my gloves tighter and turned toward the driveway, my mind already moving ahead, mapping not just what had been done, but what could be done within the same framework. Because if a single service branch could be isolated this cleanly, this precisely, without triggering an immediate system response, then there were other points, other controls, other places where flow could be adjusted, redirected, or stopped under the right conditions. And those conditions were not always what people thought they were. I started walking back toward the house, the camera still recording in. My pocket, capturing the sound of my steps, the wind, the quiet rhythm of a system still running just beneath everything. Because now that I had seen it clearly, there was only one question left. How far did that control actually reach? I stepped back inside and shut the door with a firm push, sealing in what little heat remained. But now the cold did not feel like the problem anymore. It felt like a variable, something measurable, something that could be tracked, managed, even used if you understood the system behind it. The ticking from the pipes had changed again, sharper now, more frequent, like a warning that the window for passive waiting had already closed. I moved quickly through the house, opening cabinet doors under every sink, letting what ambient air remained circulate around the exposed lines. The faucet in the kitchen was still running, a thin, steady stream, but I adjusted it slightly, increasing the flow just enough to maintain movement without wasting pressure. Every small action mattered now, not as a solution, but as a delay. I pulled my phone out again and opened the video I had just recorded, scrubbing through the frames, checking angles, clarity, making sure every detail was visible. The regulator, the line, the cutoff, the lock. It was all there, clean, undeniable. I paused on the frame where the valve sat fully closed and zoomed in, studying the mechanism again. That lock was not random. It was chosen, installed with intent. Someone had not just turned a valve. They had secured it. That meant they expected resistance. They expected someone to find it. And they wanted to make sure it stayed exactly where they left it. I exhaled slowly and set the phone down on the counter, my mind shifting from documentation to structure. Because now that I had proof, the situation was no longer about whether I could fix my heat. I already could. I knew exactly how to reverse that cutoff. I knew exactly what tool would open that valve and restore flow in less than 2 minutes. But doing that now would erase the evidence. It would reset the system without exposing the breach. And that was the difference between solving a problem and addressing what caused it. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a second, replaying the system layout in my head again. But this time I was not tracing my own line. I was expanding outward, segment by segment, branch by branch. Because infrastructure like this was never isolated. It was layered. And the same design that allowed someone to isolate my property also existed in reverse. Control points did not belong to a single direction. They existed at every level of distribution. I pushed myself upright and walked back toward the living room window, looking out at the street again. But now I was not seeing houses. I was seeing connections. Each home tied into the same network. Each line regulated, balanced, controlled through a series of points that most people never thought about. The assumption was always that those points were protected, that access was limited, that authority was clear. But that assumption had already been broken. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again, opening a set of archived diagrams I had not looked at in years. Old project files, distribution maps, pressure zones labeled in neat, precise lines that still made sense the moment I saw them. I zoomed in on the section that matched this neighborhood, tracing the main feed as it branched into smaller segments, then into individual service lines. There it was again. The pattern, the structure, and more importantly, the symmetry. For every point that allowed isolation at the individual level, there was a corresponding point that controlled flow at a higher level. Not as precise, not as targeted, but far more impactful. I felt something settle into place as I studied the layout, something that had been building since the moment I saw that locked valve. This was not about retaliation. It was about scale, about understanding what had been used against me and recognizing that it did not stop where they thought it did. I glanced back toward the utility closet, toward the silent furnace, then toward the kitchen where the water still ran, then back out at the street again. Everything connected. Everything depended on flow. And flow could be controlled. Not recklessly, not blindly, but precisely within the same framework they had already stepped into. I lowered the phone slowly, the plan forming not as a reaction, but as a response built on structure, on knowledge, on the same system they had just misused. Because once you understood where the boundaries actually were, you also understood what happened when someone ignored them. I moved toward the door again, pulling my coat tighter, the cold inside the house no longer something to fight, but something to account for. Time was still moving. The pipes were still ticking. The temperature was still dropping. But now there was a second timeline running alongside it. One that did not depend on waiting. One that depended on action taken at the right point, in the right way, under the right conditions. I reached for the handle and paused for just a second, not hesitating, just aligning everything one last time in my head. Because once I stepped back into that system, I was not just dealing with my own line anymore. I was stepping into something larger. And that changed everything. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold again, already knowing exactly where I needed to go next. I did not head back to the regulator this time. I kept walking past it, past my driveway, past the neat line of houses that all looked identical from the outside, each one sealed tight against the cold, each one depending on the same invisible system running beneath the pavement. The air felt sharper now, the wind picking up slightly, pushing loose snow across the street in thin drifting lines that caught the early light. My boots moved steady, deliberate, because I already knew where the next control point sat. It was not obvious. It never was. That was the nature of infrastructure like this. The most important parts were always the least visible. About halfway down the block, near the intersection where the main road fed into the subdivision, there was another access panel set into the ground, larger than the one near my property, reinforced, marked with utility warnings most people never read. That was not a service branch. That was a segment control point. I stopped a few feet short of it and stood there for a moment, looking around, not because I was worried about being seen, but because I was aligning everything again in my head. Houses to the left, houses to the right, lines running beneath all of them, branching out from this single node. Pressure regulated here before distribution continued deeper into the neighborhood. This was where flow became shared. I crouched down slowly and brushed away the layer of snow covering the panel, exposing the metal surface underneath. Cold, solid, unremarkable unless you knew what you were looking at. I pulled my phone out again, switching back to video, capturing the location, the markings, the context. Primary segment regulator, I said quietly, my voice steady in the cold air. Feeds downstream residential distribution. Active network confirmed. I moved the camera across the surface, showing the intact seals, the official tags, the difference between this and the unauthorized cutoff I had documented earlier. This was how it was supposed to look. Controlled. Accountable. Traceable. I set the phone down carefully on the edge of the sidewalk, angling it to keep recording, then reached for the panel and lifted it open. The metal hinge groaned slightly in the cold, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the quiet morning. Underneath, the system revealed itself in clean, functional lines. Valves, gauges, regulators, each one positioned with purpose, each one part of a larger balance that kept everything running smoothly. I leaned in closer, scanning the layout, confirming what I already knew from the diagrams. This node controlled pressure distribution for this entire section of the neighborhood, not individual homes, not single service lines, multiple properties tied together through a shared feed. I did not touch anything yet. I just observed, letting the structure settle into place in front of me, matching it against the map in my head. Because this was not about reacting. It was about understanding the scale of what had been opened the moment they touched my line. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my gloves tighter, adjusting them for better grip. Then looked back at the camera for a second, not addressing it, just acknowledging that everything from this point forward needed to be clear, documented, precise. Because once you moved beyond your own property and into shared infrastructure, every action carried weight beyond the immediate effect. I shifted my focus back to the system and traced the main feed with my eyes, following it to the regulator that balanced pressure across the downstream lines. That was the point, not the individual cutoffs, not the branches, the regulator itself. That was where flow could be adjusted in a way that affected more than one property at a time. I exhaled slowly, watching the vapor drift downward into the open panel, and let the full picture settle in. They had assumed control at the smallest level. They had isolated one house, believing it would stay contained, believing the system would not respond beyond that boundary. But the system did not recognize intention. It responded to configuration. And configuration could be changed at any level if you understood how it was built. I straightened up slightly, my eyes still on the exposed valves, the gauges, the quiet movement of gas through lines that most people never thought about. This was not about shutting anything down. Not yet. This was about confirming capability, about understanding exactly what could be done within the same framework they had already misused. Because once that line had been crossed, it was no longer theoretical. It was practical, real. I reached down and placed my hand lightly on the edge of the panel, feeling the cold metal against my glove, grounding myself in the moment before taking any further step. The houses around me were still quiet, still warm, still operating under the assumption that their systems were stable, protected, untouchable. That assumption was built on trust. Trust that no one would interfere without authorization. Trust that boundaries would be respected. That trust had already been broken. I lifted my hand slightly, my mind fully aligned now. Every piece of the system clear, every connection understood, and for the first time since this started, the situation felt balanced again. Not resolved. Not yet. But balanced. Because now I was not the only one who understood how this worked. I glanced once more at the regulator, at the steady flow moving through it, and then at the quiet street beyond, and realized something simple but important. They had treated this like a one-sided move. They had assumed there would be no equal response. That was the mistake. I reached for the nearest control point and paused, just long enough to confirm one final detail in my head before moving forward. I did not move the valve right away. My hand hovered there for a second, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. Systems like this do not forgive impulsive decisions. Every adjustment has a consequence, and once you cross from observation into action, you own that consequence whether you intended it or not. I lowered my hand slowly and shifted my focus back to the layout, tracing the regulator again, confirming pressure direction, confirming downstream load. The gauges were steady. No fluctuations. That meant the system was balanced exactly as designed, which also meant any change I introduced would be immediate, visible. I picked up my phone again and adjusted the camera angle, making sure the entire assembly was clearly in frame. Primary regulator, stable pressure, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the cold biting through the air. No system faults. No recorded intervention. I paused for a second, then added, current configuration feeding full downstream load. That mattered, because what I was about to do was not random. It was controlled, measured. I reached down again, this time gripping the adjustment handle firmly through my glove, feeling the resistance of the mechanism beneath it. Solid, maintained. This was not something that had been tampered with. This was how the system was supposed to operate, which meant any change here would be fully within the structure of the network itself. I exhaled slowly and began to turn the control, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to shift the balance. The metal responded with a low, tight movement, the kind you feel more than hear, a subtle resistance giving way under steady pressure. I watched the gauge closely as I did it, tracking the drop in output pressure, not eliminating flow, not cutting it entirely, just reducing it to a level that would ripple through the downstream lines. Enough to be noticed, enough to be felt, but not enough to trigger a full emergency response. Precision mattered. I stopped once the needle settled into a lower range, holding there for a second, confirming stability. No alarms. No irregular spikes. Just a controlled reduction. I released the handle and stepped back slightly, keeping my eyes on the system, listening. There was no dramatic shift. No sudden sound. Just a subtle change in the underlying movement, a difference that would not be obvious here, but would carry through every connected line downstream. Every furnace, every heater, every home drawing from this segment. I picked up my phone again and spoke clearly, documenting the change. Pressure adjusted within operational range, I said. System remains active. No shutdown. Controlled distribution reduction. I let the camera linger on the gauge for a moment longer, then ended the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The cold air moved around me again, but now it felt different. Not just an environment, but a condition that would begin to shift inside those houses in ways their owners would not immediately understand. Not failure. Not yet. Just a subtle drop. A furnace running longer. A room that did not warm as quickly. A system working harder to maintain what it assumed would always be stable. I closed the panel carefully, lowering it back into place, sealing the system as I had found it, leaving no visible trace beyond what had already been documented. Because this was not about damage. It was about awareness. About demonstrating something they had ignored. I stood up and looked down the street again, at the quiet homes, at the faint traces of heat escaping through vents and rooftops, at the normalcy that still existed for now. It would not last long. Not at this temperature. Not with reduced pressure feeding every line. The system would compensate at first. It always did. But compensation has limits. And once those limits are reached, people start asking questions. I turned slowly and began walking back toward my house, my pace steady, my thoughts aligned. Because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a response that operated on the same principles they had already used. They had isolated one property, believing it would stay contained, believing the system would not respond beyond that boundary. Now the system itself would carry the response outward, evenly, predictably, across every connected point. I reached my driveway and paused for a second, looking at my own house again, at the frost thickening across the windows, at the silence inside that still needed to be addressed. That part had not changed. I still needed to restore my own heat. But now that restoration would happen under a different context. Not as a quiet fix. Not as a hidden correction. As part of a larger sequence that would force visibility where there had been none. I stepped up onto the porch, the wood creaking faintly under my boots, and reached for the door handle, already hearing the faint difference in the air behind me. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. The system had begun to respond. I opened the door and stepped inside, the cold meeting me again, but this time it did not feel one-sided anymore. Because somewhere down the line, something else had already started to change. I closed the door behind me and stood still for a moment, listening, not to the silence this time, but to the subtle differences beneath it. The air inside still carried that sharp edge of cold, but something else had shifted, something faint and almost unnoticeable unless you knew what to listen for. Systems do not react instantly. They respond in layers. First pressure, then flow, then behavior. I walked slowly back toward the kitchen, my boots dull against the hardwood, and paused near the sink. The water was still running in a thin stream, steady, controlled, but I adjusted it slightly again, maintaining movement through the lines, buying time while the larger system outside began to recalibrate around the change I had introduced. The ticking in the pipes had not stopped, but it had changed tone, less sharp, more irregular, like the system was trying to stabilize under new conditions. That was expected. I leaned against the counter and glanced at my phone, watching for any sign of response, any message, any indication that the shift downstream had been noticed. It did not take long. The first sign was not a call. It was sound. A distant hum cutting off somewhere down the block, followed by a pause, then restarting, longer this time, more strained. A furnace cycling differently than it should. That was how it began. Not failure. Adjustment. Compensation. I moved toward the window again and looked out, scanning the street, watching for changes that most people would dismiss. A neighbor's garage door opened halfway, then stopped, then closed again. A figure stepped out onto a porch across the street, pulling a coat tighter, glancing up at a vent that should have been pushing stronger heat into the cold air. Small things. Subtle. But they added up. The system was under pressure now, Not enough to break, but enough to make itself known. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the utility closet, opening it again, checking the furnace. Still silent. Still cut off. That part had not changed yet, and I did not expect it to. My line was still isolated. That was a separate issue, one I had not reversed yet by design. I reached in and ran my hand along the internal components again, confirming the same absence of flow, the same controlled shutdown. It would stay that way until I chose to change it. But now that choice existed alongside something else. A wider effect. I closed the panel and stood there for a second, feeling the cold air press in again, but it did not feel like a disadvantage anymore. It felt like part of a system in motion. Because once pressure dropped across a segment, even slightly, it created demand. And demand created attention. People notice when their systems do not behave the way they expect. They check thermostats. They adjust settings. They call. And those calls do not go to the HOA. They go to the utility company. I picked up my phone again, not to call anyone, just to watch. Waiting for the moment when isolated complaints turned into a pattern. It did not take long. The screen lit up with a notification. Not from Mark this time. From a neighborhood group chat I had muted weeks ago. Messages stacking quickly, one after another. Is anyone else having trouble with heat? My furnace is running non-stop, but it is not getting warm. Gas pressure issue maybe? I scrolled through them slowly, reading without reacting, letting the pattern form exactly as expected. Multiple homes. Same symptoms. Reduced efficiency. Not a shutdown. Not an emergency. Just enough disruption to force attention. That was the point. I set the phone down again and walked back toward the front of the house, glancing out once more. More movement now. More people stepping outside, checking vents, looking confused, trying to understand something they could not see. The system was speaking now. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it could not be ignored. And that meant the next layer was already in motion. Utility monitoring systems would register the pressure drop. Dispatch would start correlating reports. Field teams would be notified. Not immediately, not urgently, but steadily. Structured. Just like everything else in this system. I exhaled slowly and stepped back from the window, my thoughts narrowing again, aligning with the next step. Because this was not about leaving things in imbalance. This was about forcing visibility. About creating a condition where what had been done to my line could no longer stay hidden behind paperwork and vague authority. I turned toward the kitchen, toward the running water, toward the ticking pipes, toward the reality that still needed to be addressed inside my own house. That had not changed. The cold was still there. The system inside my walls was still cut off. But now it existed within a larger context, one that would bring attention exactly where it needed to go. I reached for my phone again, this time scrolling back to Mark's contact, not calling yet, just holding there for a second, knowing that the next conversation would be different from the last. Because now I was not reporting a problem. I was showing a pattern, and patterns inside regulated systems do not stay unexamined for long. I looked back toward the utility closet one more time, then toward the door, the plan already clear, the sequence already in motion, and for the first time since this started, the situation felt like it was shifting in my favor. Somewhere down the line, someone had already noticed something was off. I did not wait any longer. I tapped Mark's name and brought the phone to my ear, my eyes still on the window as movement outside picked up, more doors opening, more people stepping out into the cold, their breath visible, their expressions confused in that quiet, searching way that comes when something familiar stops behaving the way it should. He answered faster this time. Tell me you are seeing this on your end, I said. There was no hesitation. Pressure drop across segment 3, he replied immediately. Not critical, but enough to flag. We are getting calls now. Multiple addresses. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, watching a neighbor across the street tap on his thermostat through the glass like it might respond differently if he tried again. It is not a system fault, I said. It is controlled. There was a brief pause, then a shift in his tone, sharper now, more focused. You adjusted something, he said. It was not a question. I did not answer directly. I documented an unauthorized cutoff on my service line, I said instead. Locked valve. No service record. No utility authorization. That is where this started. Another pause, longer this time, but not uncertainty. Calculation. Alignment. If what you are saying is accurate, he said slowly, then we are dealing with external interference inside a regulated system. You are, I replied. And now it is no longer isolated. The weight of that settled between us for a second, not heavy, just clear. Because once a pattern formed across multiple properties, it moved beyond a single complaint. It became something the system itself had to address. I need that documentation, he said. Everything you recorded. You will have it, I replied. But understand this clearly. My line was cut first. Deliberately. I hear you, he said. And if that is confirmed, this is going to escalate fast. I looked back toward the utility closet for a moment, then out at the street again, where more people were now gathered, talking, pointing, trying to make sense of something they could not see. It already has, I said quietly. He did not argue. Field team is being rerouted, he said. We will have someone on site as soon as possible. Good, I replied, because they are going to need to see exactly where this started. I ended the call and lowered the phone, the next part already moving into place. This was no longer just between me and the HOA. The system had been engaged. Oversight had been triggered. And once that happened, everything that had been hidden behind vague authority and selective enforcement was about to be pulled into the open. I turned toward the door again and stepped outside, the cold hitting just as hard as before, but now it felt like part of something larger, something unfolding across the entire street. The quiet had changed. It was not still anymore. It was active. Voices carried. Doors opened and closed. A car pulled slowly out of a driveway and stopped, the driver looking confused, glancing at the dashboard, then back toward the house. I walked down the steps and onto the driveway, my pace steady, my focus clear. Because now it was not just about documentation. It was about visibility. I crossed the street, not toward the regulator this time, but toward the small cluster of neighbors forming near the corner. Conversations paused slightly as I approached, not out of suspicion, just curiosity. Anyone else noticing their heat struggling? One of them asked, his voice carrying a mix of concern and frustration. I nodded once. Pressure drop in the line, I said. It is affecting the whole segment. Is it a utility issue? Another asked. I met his eyes for a second, then shook my head slightly. Not exactly, I said. But it is being looked at now. That was enough. Not a full explanation. Not yet. Just enough to align what they were experiencing with something larger than individual systems. I stepped back from the group after a moment, letting their conversation continue, letting the pattern build without interference. Because the more people noticed, the more it spread, the faster it moved through the system. I turned and walked back toward my house again, my mind already shifting to the next step, the final alignment of everything that had been set in motion. The evidence was recorded. The pattern was visible. The utility company was engaged. Now there was only one thing left to do on my end. I reached my driveway and paused for a second, looking at the frost-covered windows, at the silent furnace inside, at the problem that had started all of this. My line was still cut. That had not changed. But now restoring it would not erase anything. It would complete the sequence. I stepped up onto the porch and opened the door, moving straight through the cold interior toward the utility closet, my movements precise, controlled, because now every action had a place in the larger structure. I reached down and picked up the tool I had set aside earlier, the one I knew would fit the lock on that unauthorized valve, the one that would reverse what had been done without damaging the evidence already captured. I held it for a second, feeling its weight, not heavy, just specific, designed for a purpose most people never thought about. Then I turned back toward the door, because restoring my line was no longer just a fix. It was the final step in making everything visible. I stepped outside again, the cold air rushing in, sharper than before, but now it carried something else with it. Momentum. I walked back toward the cutoff point, the same path I had taken before, but this time there was no uncertainty, no analysis left to do. Just execution. I crouched down, brushed away the thin layer of frost again, and exposed the locked valve exactly as I had recorded it earlier. The system had not changed. The evidence was still intact. I positioned the tool carefully against the lock, aligning it with the mechanism, feeling the exact point where it would engage. This was the moment where everything shifted from observation to resolution, from imbalance back to structure. I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but to confirm one last detail in my head. The pattern was set. The system was watching. And now the cause would meet the response. I applied steady pressure and felt the mechanism begin to give. I felt the lock give under steady pressure, not a snap, not a break, just a controlled release as the mechanism disengaged exactly the way it was designed to. The metal shifted slightly in my hand, the resistance fading, and for a brief second everything was still again, like the system itself was holding its breath. I adjusted my grip and turned the valve slowly, deliberately, reversing the position that had cut my line off from the rest of the network. The movement was smooth, precise, the kind that comes from components maintained correctly, built to respond without hesitation when used the way they were intended. I watched the position align back to open and stopped, holding it there for a second, confirming the change visually before letting go. Then I stepped back and listened. It did not happen instantly. Systems like this do not respond with drama. They respond with flow. A faint, almost imperceptible shift moved through the line beneath my feet, subtle but real, like pressure finding its path again after being held back. I replaced the access cover carefully, sealing the point exactly as I had found it aside from the corrected position, leaving no new disruption, no additional interference. Everything was back within the structure it was supposed to operate under. I stood up and looked down the street again, the cold still sharp in the air, but something else had already begun to change. The same houses that had been quietly struggling moments before were now adjusting again, systems recalibrating under restored conditions. Not instantly comfortable, not immediately stable, but moving in that direction. I turned and walked back toward my house, my steps steady, my focus no longer on what had been done, but on what had just been completed. Because restoring my own line was not just about heat. It was about closing the loop. The evidence had been captured. The pattern had been exposed. The system had been engaged. And now the original imbalance had been corrected without erasing any part of what led to it. I stepped onto my porch and opened the door, the cold air inside still present, still heavy, but already beginning to feel less absolute. I moved straight to the utility closet and opened it, watching the furnace for a moment, waiting. Then it happened. A soft click, a brief pause, and then the low, steady ignition sequence I had been expecting from the start. The system came back to life exactly as it should, controlled, measured, responding to the restored supply without hesitation. Warm air would not reach every room immediately, but it did not need to. The process had started. That was enough. I closed the panel and stepped back, letting the sound of the system running fill the space again, replacing the silence that had defined everything just hours before. I walked into the living room and looked out the window once more, watching as more neighbors stepped back inside their homes, their initial confusion giving way to quiet relief as their system stabilized. The street was returning to normal, but it was not the same normal it had been before. Something had shifted beneath it, something that would not go unnoticed for long. My phone buzzed again in my hand. This time it was Mark. I answered without hesitation. "We have a field team en route," he said immediately. "They are already reviewing the pressure logs. The drop and recovery are both recorded." I nodded slightly, my eyes still on the street. "They will find the cutoff," I said. "It is documented." "Then this is going to move fast," he replied. "Unauthorized interference inside a regulated line does not stay quiet." "It should not," I said. There was a brief pause, then a shift in his tone, not surprise, not concern, just recognition. "You handled this carefully," he said. I let out a slow breath, watching the last of the frost begin to fade from the edges of the window. "I handled it within the system," I replied. That was the difference. Not reaction, not escalation. Structure. The line went quiet for a second, then he spoke again. "We will take it from here." I ended the call and lowered the phone, the weight of everything settling into place, not heavy, just complete. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the kitchen, turning off the faucet, closing the cabinet doors, letting the house return to a state it should have never left. The ticking in the pipes had stopped. The air was already beginning to soften. The system had corrected itself because it had been allowed to operate the way it was designed to. I leaned lightly against the counter and stood there for a moment, not thinking ahead, not looking back, just letting the present settle. Because this had never been about proving a point through force. It had been about exposing a boundary that should never have been crossed in the first place. They had assumed control without understanding the system they were stepping into. They had believed it would remain contained, that it would not extend beyond the single action they took. But systems like this do not isolate consequences. They distribute them. I pushed myself upright and walked back toward the living room one last time, glancing out at the street now calm again, quiet, stable, the same surface appearance as before, but built on a different awareness underneath. Because once something like this is exposed, it does not disappear. It becomes part of the structure moving forward. I stood there for a second, then turned away, the warmth beginning to return around me, steady, reliable, exactly as it should have been from the start. They tried to control the system without understanding it.